I want to thank everybody for joining us for another Throwdown Thursday. Today's guest, we have with us Dr. Dee Singh-Knight, Extension Specialist with Agribusiness Economics and Management, and she's going to talk to us about a really important topic, food safety. So I'll let Dee take it from here.
All right. So thank you very much, Zach, and welcome everyone. So as Zach says, I go by Dr. D. I am with WVU Extension Service, and today we'll talk a little bit about food safety, or mostly produce safety. How are we growing, and how are we maintaining that food, that produce, up until the time it gets to our kitchen, right? So that's what we're going to concentrate on. Typically, there's a team of us like Jody. I see Stacy's on. Typically, we do this for commercial producers because there are some laws and rules and regulations when it comes to producing produce for sale at your local avenues, like your farmers markets and so on, or to local wholesalers and retailers. We're not going to get that deep into it unless we do have some commercial producers or people who sell at the farmers market or in a CSA, anything like that. If you want to ask, deeper questions, I will entertain those. But for today, we'll sort of just keep it basic, talk about the importance, obviously, of produce safety. I'll just go ahead and, okay. And so talk about that, the importance of produce safety, talk about some basic considerations for as you grow food, what are some things that you should be doing? And then if you're thinking about, I have some food, I want to be able to sell that surplus, we'll kind of talk about a little bit of an action plan. What are some of the things that you would need to put in place, right? So again, I'll just be skimming the surface, but you are free to ask me any further questions that you want to. So let's talk about just some beginning considerations for producers, backyard gardeners, people who are producing for a market, or people who are just dabbling, you just want enough produce just for your home consumption, okay? So first of all, why are we talking about the issue of food safety? Because it is a public health imperative. I mean, I know that you have had at least one occasion where you have eaten something that you have either bought or you've grown yourself, and maybe you've gotten sick. In fact, about 1 in 6 Americans every year get sick from some sort of food that they consume. About 120,000 of those are actually hospitalized, and we have about 3,000 of those that die every year. So it's a serious issue, right? So this is food that you would just consume in the normal market. A lot of that is traced back to farms. So I'm putting this in here to show you, even for the food that you consume outside of the food that you grow, some of that can potentially make you sick. A lot of that, as I say, about 1 million of that incidences, it can be traced back to farms. So the point being that, these accidents, these food outbreaks can happen on any farm, whether that's a large farm, a small farm, a micro farm, right? A lot of people, maybe that's why you grow your own food, right? Because you don't trust the food in the larger market. But having said that, you also need to be aware as you're growing your own food, what are some of the precautions I need to take to ensure that I am not, growing what we call contaminated produce, right? How do I protect my produce from contamination? So before we go any further, I want you to talk to me. So you can either unmute, let me know, type it in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with. I want you to tell me, what do you think is the best way to practice produce safety? How do we ensure that the strawberries that my kid is consuming is sort of free of these contaminants? Is it prevention, preventing the contaminants? Is it I should take corrective actions as soon as I realize there's a problem? Or should I take action after someone I have either given my produce to, sold my produce to, or if my kids eat my produce after I realize there's a problem, do I want to take action then? So, what is the best way you think to practice produce safety? Wash them before eating, okay? Prevention, right? So if I'm growing my produce, you want me to pay attention to prevention. What else? Anybody else? Yeah, so if I'm growing, be careful of what you are putting on your plants. That's an important one. Jody said, keep animals out of the garden. That's right, Jody. Very important. Okay. Yeah. So as far as we grow produce, right? So one of the things we really want to make sure of when it comes to produce safety is prevention, right? So you want to prevent these contaminants from getting on your produce in the first place. And I'll tell you why that is important. And I'll just give you a heads up. The most important reason why we want to prevent it in the first place is once it gets on my produce, it's really hard to get rid of it. Okay. Now, if you didn't prevent it and you realize there is a problem, obviously you want to take action after somebody has pointed out there is an issue, right? We want to go back and we want to trace back to where can this issue have potentially come about. But we certainly want, as we're growing our own produce, we want to make sure that we're preventing. And as my friend said, as Mary said, certainly we want to wash them before eating, right? But sometimes, just by the nature of these contaminants, they're in the nooks and crannies of the strawberries and so on. Sometimes even washing is really difficult to get these contaminants out, right? So we want to make sure that we're preventing those from our produce in the first place. And for the produce we grow, we have some control over that. So that's what we're talking about today. So when we think about produce safety, what we're trying to focus on as we grow our own produce is to make sure we're preventing these contaminants from getting in our produce. And we call these contaminants pathogens. So today I am just talking about these microorganisms, these living things that can contaminate our produce. We can also talk about chemicals, right? So somebody pointed out, so Mary also said, be careful of what you're Mary Almond said, be careful of what you're putting on your plants. So that's important. So from a chemical, pesticides, fertilizer perspective, you want to make sure, that when you're fertilizing or applying pesticides and so on, that you're making sure you comply with the withdrawal dates and so on. We can also talk about, physical contaminants. So when I am washing and so on, or if I am laying out my produce on a table, for example, there are no wood splinters, there are no paint chips, and so on. But what I will focus on today is talking about these microorganisms. And I'll tell you what those microorganisms are. But so certainly the microorganisms, the one that causes us a problem, those are referred to as pathogens. So pathogens are really microscopic organisms that are disease causing, that cause us to be sick. They make us vomit, they make us go to the bathroom, those kinds of things, right? Those are the ones we want to be careful about. And the reason for that is because we do want to keep our family safe. If we're selling those produce, we certainly want to keep our customers safe, right? And again, as I say, if you're scaling up production to be able to sell those products, again, you want to keep your customers safe. You want to comply, like I said before, there are certain regulations in the market. You do have to comply with those. But also, if you sell contaminated produce they can trace it back to you, then chances are that you can be sued for causing injury or death to one of your customers. So we're not going to get into that because that's a little bit, if you're selling commercially and so on. But we're going to focus on the first two, keeping these pathogens out of our food in order to protect our families. Okay? And when I talk about these pathogens, these microorganisms, I'm talking about certain species of bacteria and viruses and parasites. So there are some bacteria, for example, there is E. coli, there is monocytogenes, there's salmonella, and these are the ones that are pathogenic. These are the ones that are disease causing. So just to put this into perspective, there are about 30,000 different microorganisms that live all around us. They live in our homes, they live in our gardens, they live inside of us, like you have this gut bacteria. So they live inside of us, and they're very helpful for the most parts. There are about 30,000 of them. There are about 3,000 of them. No, sorry, scratch that. So there are 30,000 of them that exist. There are about 30 of them, just 30 of them that are pathogenic. They cause us diseases, and we can get really, really sick. And in fact, it did not just cause us to have diarrhea or to vomit. Sometimes, if depending on that person that it affects, we can have chronic illnesses for a long time, right? So it can affect, if it happens to somebody who's already immune compromised, it can have devastating effects. So we're trying to keep these 30 microorganisms. So there are certain strains of bacteria, there's certain strains of viruses, like something that's called norovirus. Norovirus is, you probably would have heard about that. They call it commonly, they call it the cruise ship virus, right? Because typically when you're on a cruise, 5,000 people in the middle of the ocean, they're on this ship, it's like a big house. And when one person gets sick, it sort of spreads to other people, right? So that's your norovirus. That's caused by a virus, a pathogenic virus. And then you have a lot of parasites, right? So the important thing, we wouldn't go into all of these different things, but there are some strains of these bacteria, viruses, and parasites that are pathogenic. They're disease causing. They cause us to be sick. And the reason why I said prevention is really important, because when we consume, especially when we're consuming produce, fresh fruits and vegetables, we are consuming those raw. So we're eating our strawberries or our melons or our lettuce and leafy greens and tomatoes and onions and spinach and those kinds of things. We're consuming those raw. Once the pathogens get on these, look, there are lots of places for those pathogens to basically hide and shield themselves. So even as Mary said, if we're trying to wash our fresh fruits and vegetables before we consume them, typically we can't wash out all of these microorganisms because they hide in these little crevices. They are microorganisms. I can't even see them. So they have lots of places to hide. So we want to prevent them from getting on the surface in the first place. Because as I say, once they get on there, if I have rough surfaces, folding, netting like here, or if there are any scarring and so on, they can get in there, they can hide. But other than that, once they get on there and the conditions are right, they multiply really, really quickly. So a small amount of bacteria gets to a giant amount in a really quick time. I frequently like to say in my food safety training classes, you cannot sterilize your lettuce with a blowtorch, right? So you have to prevent the contamination in the first place. So that's the first thing. You have to prevent the contamination. Now, how does the contamination occur? The contamination can come from different sources on your farm. So let's say this is your farm, you have a little bit of animals, you have some, some container farming going on right around there for your fruits and vegetables. Maybe you might have some fruit trees off to the side here, whatever your setup looks like, right? Contamination can come from the soil, right? The soil here that gets splashed onto your plants, or it can come from the soil that you're growing the plants in. It can come from the water that you're applying, you're watering your plants with. So let's say you're watering with a garden hose, or you're watering with some watering cans from your pond or from your rain barrel or anything like that. That water can have pathogens in them. It can come from any animals. Let's say you have wild animals, you have deer, you have your domestic, your chickens, right, that you're raising. You have your cat and your dog. Those carry certain parasites, and they also carry bacteria, right? And when they poop, their poop gets spreads around. That's where the bacteria is contained. So both domestic and wildlife can carry pathogens. These humans that you have around you, these humans can carry these pathogens, right? And so it's important to make sure that we are not contributing to the problem as humans. And then all of your food contact surfaces. So, during COVID, we talked a lot about food contact surfaces. Make sure you're cleaning and sanitizing your high contact surface and your food contact surfaces, right? So, your doorknobs and this little culprit here, your cell phone and those things that you would touch, and then you would go touch your food, right? So those are the things when we say, your food contact surfaces, that's what we're talking about. Yeah. So, so Will says, thank God we don't have to worry about seafood pathogens. Well, we do. If you're eating your seafood raw, right, you do have, if you're a lover of sushi, you do have to worry about that. I'm just looking at the comments in the chat. So Mary said, can contaminants grow within the cell tissues of a plant taken up by the roots into the vein? So the good thing about a plant, just like humans on our skin, is that our skin and the plant tissue is naturally impervious to these pathogens. So it cannot just, if there are pathogens here, there's bacteria, here's the root of the plant, it's not going to get absorbed into that plant. So what we have to worry about is if my produce, right? So if let's say I have tomatoes, if that typically it's not going to get absorbed into the tomato unless there is some sort of a scarring or bruising or something like that where the contaminants can enter into. Other than that, if it's on the surface of the product and you consume that product, or in the case of my leafy greens, if it gets within there, it's not going to get absorbed into the tissue of the product, but it certainly can hide within the folds of this. And that's how you can consume it, right? So that's another thing. And I see Andrea, I think that's Andre. I'm not sure how you pronounce your name. I'm sorry if I mutilated that, but she said, pull out the weeds. And sometimes the weeds, if the contaminants is on the weeds, it's it's going to grow on there and then spread to your plants, right? And then there are other reasons for getting rid of the weeds. Now, sometimes weeds can act as a cover crop. Maybe it's a trap crop. We can talk about all of those things, but that's outside of the point. So for now, we're going to say, how does our produce get contaminated, either from soil or water or our food contact surfaces or animals or humans? So We want to make sure, for example, when we have humans interacting with our food, that the humans understand what do they need to do so they don't cause a problem. The humans being you. If you're the one growing the food out in the garden, obviously, when you go to the bathroom, a lot of that bacteria or virus or parasites gets passed on to your hands, then your mouth from your feces. I'll just be very frank with you, okay? So it's really important. We learned this during COVID. Wash these things. These things are your main source of contamination. Wash them really well, okay? So you want to make sure that when you use the bathroom, you're washing your hands really well. Make sure that, your clothing, we love to say, oh, wow, we sort of praise the farmer with the dirty coveralls and those kinds of things. Thank you, Andre. I appreciate that. Um, so sometimes we can have these contamination on our clothing, our footwear, our just the clothing that we have, and that is how the contaminations can get spread. Again, your hands, your tools and equipment, right? Sometimes it's on there, like if we have the knife, it dropped into the compost pile, we pick it up, there's contamination on there, the contamination gets on my hand, I handle the produce. You see how it gets spread around. So we have to be careful, right? So hands, and then sometimes the virus, the parasites that's inside of you can get, if you have an injury, you have blood, the blood, if you don't wrap it up and take care of that, that gets onto your produce. There's contamination that way. So contamination from humans, you want to make sure that you are taking these precautions. So maintain personal cleanliness. You want to wear protective equipment like your gloves, for example. You avoid, make sure when you're handling your produce, you're not handling animals and produce at the same time, because that's a source of contamination, right? Jewelry, and again, cell phone, like sometimes we have rings and so on. That's a nice place for your microorganisms to hide under your rings and so on. Sometimes we have these fancy nails, or sometimes even our normal nails. Under those nails is a nice beehive for for your microorganisms to live. So that's why you really have to wash your hands really well. Okay, so that's as far as humans go. As far as wildlife or domestic animals, again, their feces and even their bodies can transmit these and carry these pathogens from place to place. So you want to make sure that we're not allowing these animals. We know you love them, that you want them to follow you wherever you go, but make sure that they're not a source of contamination for your products, especially the edible portion of the crop, right? When that crop is red. Well, everything, with this leafy green, everything is edible here. If I'm talking tomatoes, make sure they're not in contact with the tomato itself, those kinds of things. So just something, just something to be very careful about, okay? Something we call biological soil amendment is just a fancy word for your compost or your manure that you would be applying to either your garden beds or your high tunnel or wherever your pots, wherever you're growing this produce. So your manure, your compost, if they're not properly cured or properly treated, like if you don't leave them alone with that process for killing those microorganisms, we suggest at least 120 days before you apply that to any of your growing areas. If you don't do that, then you didn't give the microorganisms enough time to die out. And so they're there and they're multiplying. And if you use that on your growing areas, that can get transmitted to your products. So you want to be very careful. You also want to be careful while that manure and compost is curing, all right? That when you handle it, you don't immediately go handle your produce, right? You want to make sure that you're washing your hands and so on, so you're not transmitting that contamination. And certainly any tools and equipment. For example, if you're turning your compost pile, or you can have your compost, let's say in a bin, for example, and you're turning with a shovel, or you may be using this hand spade, for example, and then you take the same hand spade and you're coming to attend to your garden. That's a source of contamination, right? So you want to make sure that you are not causing, you're not making a bigger problem on your farm. So make sure that you're washing the tools and equipment, your hands, and so on in between those uses, right? Water is a very important transmitter of these pathogens. So the water itself, so let's say, for example, you have a rain barrel or a pond and you're using that water, because that water is standing and that water hasn't been treated, that can be a source of a problem, right? So because if the bacteria, the viruses, the parasites get in there, they can multiply because that water is not treated, right? And you're taking that and you're watering your plants, or you're washing your produce, or you're cleaning your food contact surfaces, or you're using that water to mop your floor, then that water can be a source of contamination, right? So you want to make sure that the water that you're using is really clean. So whether that water is, if you're irrigating your crops and so on in the production phase, or you're using it, to wash your produce, to wash your hands, to clean your food contact surfaces, and so on, that's really important. Another issue with water is flooding, right? So sometimes we live in areas that are prone to flooding. So again, you don't know what's in that flood water. That flood water is going to contaminate your produce. Best not to consume any products that have come into contact with flood water. And another important issue, so you see I have this, I'm sure you have seen this situation where, people are mopping their floor with really dirty water, right? So really what you're doing, and you see the mop that's in this condition, right? So really what you're doing when you do that, is you're spreading the contamination around. You're not really cleaning the floor. I think of it as dirty in the floor. So again, you want to make sure you're using clean water to do that. So I see I have a question from Emily. I have a rain bucket. Is there anything I should do to keep that water free of contaminants? So there are certain, so for example, you can use Sanidate, or, there are certain, so Sanidate is a version of bleach, for example, that is basically used for, as an additive to this type of standing water, to basically, let's say, to purify the water, to kill any contaminants in there. So you can use something like that for your rainwater. You have to make sure that you are mixing that in the correct proportions based on how much water you're trying to treat. That's the most important thing. So with a lot of these, for example, like Sanidate, right? You have to be able to, so sometimes it's just a few drops and you're like, what is that drop going to do? Let me pour a cup. You have to pay attention to that, okay? So I'm seeing Will said quat sanitizer. So I'm not sure what quat sanitizer is, whether that's a typo or whether that's a thing. Will, can you explain what quat sanitizer is? I am not Quanitary mine. I am not sure about that, but if it is a sanitizer specifically for adding to water for as a sanitizer. It has to be approved for use with fruits and vegetables. So it has to be food grade. Yes. So if it's for food surfaces, now again, some sanitizers, have different uses. It might be just to be used to clean a food contact surface and not being used to sanitize your water. So again, you have to make sure that you're using it's a food grade. It can be used with water or it can be used with food contact surfaces. So you want to make sure you are reading that label. So the one I was referring to, Taylor, and again, I'm reading from the chat, is Sanidate. I'll just type it into the chat here. Sanidate, and it's a very popular sanitizer that is multi-purpose for your, for your water as well as for cleaning your food contact surfaces. Okay. So talking about the cleaning, yeah, so you see that quartz sanitizer Jody just posted is mostly for your food contact surfaces and not as an agent for sanitizing your water. Okay, so again, the important thing is whatever, thanks Jody, whatever you're adding, make sure it's food grade and it's for the specific purpose that you are using it for, whether it's water, whether it's food contact surface, okay? All right, another thing when we talk about produce is we want to make sure that our food contact surface, anywhere our produce is touching, including your hands, is clean because there is what we call cross-contamination. So your produce might be clean, but that surface will be dirty, right? And so if your produce comes into contact with the surface, you take it, you put it on a dirty counter. Guess what? Your counter is going to get dirty. So let's say you were preparing chicken and now you come and you're making a salad, but you didn't sanitize that surface after you prepared your chicken. Guess what? Some of that pathogens is going to get on your lettuce. And remember, you're cooking the chicken. That's okay if it had salmonella, but you're going to eat the lettuce raw, right? Or whatever you're putting in your salad. And that's the problem. Or sometimes you have a clean counter, you have clean produce, but you have dirty hands. And so as you interact with both, you're going to get that cross-contamination. So it's important that you clean, right? So anything, you're packing containers, you're picking containers, what are you putting it in? Are you picking it and putting it into a basket, into a bowl, right? All of those things are coming in contact with your produce, your kitchen utensils, right? That's why we put it in the dishwasher or we soap it because those can be a source of contamination. Hands and clothing, your water, I told you your water already, your gardening contact surfaces. Let's say in your garden, you have sort of like a table where you pick your stuff, you put it there, and then you're going to transport it to the kitchen. That can be a source of contamination. You want to clean those, right? Your kitchen areas, including your freezers and, a lot of times we tend to think, oh, I can use any water to make ice because obviously the freezing process is going to kill these things. There are certain strains of viruses that will live inside of your ice maker and your freezer. So you have to be careful, okay? And normally we say clean, right? But when we clean, right, like you wipe your surface, that's cleaning. And you clean because so you're getting rid of, any dirt, any, debris that's there. But to make your food contact surfaces, let's say your countertop, really clean is you have to sanitize. So you have to treat it with some sort of an agent, right? So that's why we have cleaning agents for our bathrooms and our kitchen counters and so on. We just don't clean it with water because water is not going to kill those microorganisms, right? So we always like to say, sometimes, you ever you go to a restaurant or something, maybe sometimes even your kitchen counter or your breakfast table. But, sometimes you go to the restaurant and you touch the table and it's really sticky. You know what that is? That's a bunch of microorganisms on there. And some of them can be pathogenic, right? We call that biofilm. It's really a bunch of microorganisms that don't want you to kill it. So they exude this sort of sticky thing to protect themselves. So they have this sticky substance over them and they hide under that. So this is my pathogen and this is the sticky thing. And that's on the top of the table. Now, if you're only cleaning your table with water and you're not using a cleaning agent, a sanitizer to kill those microorganisms, guess what? They like the water because water just gives them the right conditions to grow, and they grow and grow, and that's what you feel like, that sticky thing. So you really have to get a little elbow grease in there, a little, cleaning agent, and really scrub those things off your surface, right? So yeah, that was a roundabout in a lot. I thought I was going to take 15 minutes and I took more than a half hour. So that was just the tip of the iceberg. What kinds of questions do you guys have for me? So Andre said all water should be clean. That's very, very important. Any water that you're using to irrigate with or to do any sort of cleaning must be what we call potable. Potable means it must be free of any contamination, right? So if you are a commercial producer, one of the things we would require is that you do some testing of that water. If you guys are not commercial producers, then you really want to make sure you're paying attention to the water you're using, right? And then the other thing, as Andre said, not all water is created equally. So you have your municipal water, that's safe. You have your well water, that's moderately safe. If your well is compromised in some ways, probably not going to be, but if your well is well capped and you have a backflow prevention thing and all that, the well water should be good. What's the culprit is that surface water, your pond water, your streams, your catchment water, right? Rain barrels and so on. Baxter said if you use water from your well, test it annually, right? Especially as we're in a fracking zone and so on. Or if that well is not, is not well maintained. Yes, you want to test your well water. If it is clean water. So the thing, Andre, is you can't tell just by looking at water if water is clean or not, right? Because those microorganisms, you can't really see it, right? And so testing is always a good idea. Again, if you are selling commercially, testing is required. Yeah, so some farms, Baxter said, some farms capture water from streams, and in that case, that water should be tested to ensure that it meets the required quality for using it for gardening or food production purposes. Will says, is it fair to say that vegetables grown in the ground or with ground contact are more susceptible to pathogens versus vegetables above ground like tomatoes? Um, so yes, but no, right? So even if something is grown in the ground, but you're paying attention to the soil amendments, your manure, your compost, and so on that you are putting in there, it should be safe, right? Um, and you're keeping out animals and so on. But you're right, if I have something, especially like my tomatoes in a high tunnel, I'm keeping out my birds, I'm keeping out my domestic animals and so on. I'm maintaining all of these food safety protocols. That should be relatively safe. Okay? Yeah, good questions. Water wheels to get clean water. So make sure unless that water wheel has some sort of a treating agent. Remember, we're talking microorganisms, right? So unless there is, maybe the water wheel is basically aerating the water or something like that, but I would want something to basically sanitize that water to get rid of those microorganisms that are in that water. Yeah. So those are all the comments I see. I hope I didn't miss any. Um, yeah. Any final questions before we leave?
And Dee, I'd like to mention that if folks want to get, for people that have been on here before, they know the drill, but to get points for your county teams for attending, you need to take a survey, and I've just put the link to that survey in the chat. And we always have a code word for that. And what do you think would be a good code word, Dee? Pathogen, maybe?
Yes, pathogen. Pathogen. There we go. Pathogen.
So yeah, the link is in the chat. The code word is pathogen. Be sure and use that at the end of the survey so we give you your points. And Jody just mentioned that next week's program is non-traditional gardening with Alex Smith. So we can all look forward to that. If you missed any part of this, or if you want to send it to somebody else, we've recorded today's session and we're going to put it on our YouTube channel. And we'll push that out on all the Grow This social medias as well.
All right. Well, I don't see any more comments in the chat, and I think I covered all of those. So, Zach, I think that's it.
Dr. D, thank you so much. This has been like really, really enlightening and helpful, and it's definitely something that I hope we all consider as we're growing our garden this year. Thank you so much for doing this. This was
Thank you,
fantastic.
and thank you all for attending. Appreciate it. Have a good day, everyone.